Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I am Wendy Penn, NAR's Housing Opportunity Program Manager. I have just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We muted your microphone upon entry, and we ask that you turn off your video for today's presentation. Feel free to use the Q&A or chat feature to ask a question of our presenters, or you may raise your hand at the end of the session to speak directly with our presenters. We will let you know when you've been unmuted. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we will share a PDF of our presenter slides with you in a follow-up email. You will find the playback link for the recording of today's webinar on the website that you used to register within the next 2 days, and we will also post the recording on the Realtor Party site. If you hear something today that you want to share on social media, please be sure to tag us. We will put a hashtag and handles in the chat box for you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Pete Koff, NAR's 2020 Realtor Party Director, who will formally welcome you to today's webinar. Pete?
Well, thanks, Wendy, and thank you all for joining us. I am Pete Koff. I am the 2020 Realtor Party Director. Welcome to Land Banking, Returning Properties to Productive Use. This is the final webinar in our 4-part series, Stabilizing and Revitalizing Neighborhoods in the COVID-19 Era. This webinar series is part of NAR's Transforming Neighborhoods program, which we offer in partnership with the Center for Community Progress. Transforming Neighborhoods provides realtors with the opportunity to learn alongside their local partners about underlying factors that keep vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties stuck in decline, and explore ways to bring these properties back to productive use to create more vibrant and equitable communities. So we all know that issues associated with vacancy are definitely and abandonment predate COVID-19. However, the coronavirus pandemic has brought new attention to these challenges. The good news is that with these challenges comes the opportunity to strengthen partnerships and examine how we can build more equitable and resilient communities. So regardless of the scope or the scale of the problem in your area, now is the time for realtors, local government, and other stakeholders to develop strategies to stabilize and revitalize neighborhoods. This webinar series has provided information and tools to guide you in that process. Over the past several weeks, we've learned the early indicators of vacancy and examined several intervention techniques to address those warning signs. We also explored how strategic code enforcement can prevent property decline caused by the COVID-19 crisis. During our last webinar, we made the connections between property tax enforcement, vacancy, and neighborhood stabilization. So if you've missed any of those webinars, you can view the recordings at realtorparty.realtor/transforming. And we're going to share that link with you in the chat box. So today, we learn how land banks can help resolve some of the toughest barriers that keep properties stuck in decline and assist in stabilizing property values and returning properties to productive use after a long-term decline or sudden shock like the pandemic. First, we're going to hear from Liz Kozo, Associate Director of the National Leadership and Education for Center for Community Progress. Liz manages training opportunities that aim to build a common awareness of problem properties within communities and assist community leaders in determining roles each can play in a comprehensive approach to vacancy and abandonment. Prior to joining Community Progress, Liz served as the Assistant Director for the Turtle Creek Valley Council of Governments, a multi-municipal agency in the Mon Valley of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. She worked to establish a multi-municipal code enforcement program and oversaw the development of a data system aimed at increasing officer efficiency and effectiveness. Liz was also a member of the leadership team to form the Tri-Cog Land Bank, a multi-municipal community-driven land bank. After Liz shares the information about land banks and how we can use it as an effective tool for neighborhood stabilization, we'll hear from Laura Lafayette with the Richmond Association of Realtors. Laura is the Chief Executive Officer of Richmond Association of Realtors and the Central Virginia Regional Multiple Listing Service, both organizations that serve over 6,000 realtors in Central Virginia. Within the broader community, Laura serves as a governor's appointee to the Virginia Housing Commission, is the chair of the Board of Housing Virginia, is the founding chair of the board of the Maggie L. Walker Community Land Trust, is the immediate past chair of Homeward, and serves on the boards of Partnership for Housing, Affordability, and the Peter Paul Development Center, as well as the local advisory committee of Virginia LISC and the vestry of Christ Church Episcopal. We look forward to hearing from all of our speakers, and now I'll turn it over to Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Pete. And thank you, Wendy, for that wonderful introduction. Give me just a moment to pop up my slides here. All right, so I'm hoping you can all hear me, and if you can't, somebody jump on the screen and saying we have no clue what the heck you're saying over there. So first, as Pete mentioned, I am with the Center for Community Progress, and we really do appreciate the partnership that we've had with the National Association of Realtors, not just for this webinar series, but over the past couple of years. In communities, vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties pose serious challenges that we all know, and solving them requires a coordinated effort. So we certainly appreciate the important role that you all on the call play as realtors in your communities, not just knowing what's happening on the ground and having such deep knowledge of the real estate markets, but also anticipating trends in neighborhoods, which will be really critical in terms of developing viable solutions for any economic impacts that we see related to COVID-19. So we've certainly appreciated learning from you, learning alongside you, engaging in conversation over the course of this webinar, and we look forward to continuing those conversations in the months and years to come. So for today, we will be talking about land banking, and this is just an outline of what I intend to cover before I hand it over to Laura, who will be giving a wonderful presentation about the work that she's doing in Richmond. So for those of you that have joined us in the past, this will certainly be a slide that you've seen before, but for those of you that are new to this series, welcome. Just want to provide a little bit of background about who we are at Community Progress. We are a national nonprofit organization that is focused on building strong and equitable communities. And we do so by looking at the policies, processes, and practices that keep properties vacant and abandoned, and also those policies, tools, and practices that can help communities steward those properties to productive use, prevent them from declining and really causing harm to neighbors and neighborhoods. So we do work all across the country through technical assistance, looking at ordinances and state policies. We do education and leadership development. We also have a robust policy and research program. So we spanned a few different areas in terms of our work. We recognize that vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties present challenges in creating equitable communities. And the problems associated with vacant properties are deeply entrenched within communities, and they take a willingness from residents, from local governments, from realtors and everybody on the call today, from folks in the private sector and the public sector and mission-driven sector to really be willing to change the status quo. Vacant properties did not happen overnight, and in many cases, they weren't unintentional. We have a history of laws and policies in this country that have led to some pretty deep community disinvestment. When we go to communities across the country, we often ask them to send us their data related to where vacant properties are, and especially where they're concentrated. And 9 times out of 10, those properties are concentrated in neighborhoods that have previously been redlined. So it's really important that we acknowledge that reality, that we call it out in order for us to develop viable solutions moving forward. The last policy that's listed on your screen here is urban renewal, which I'll touch on in just a bit. So this policy designated certain neighborhoods as blighted for the purpose of removing Black homeowners and Black business owners for the sake of redevelopment. It's this policy specifically that I'm going to try to stay away from the use of the word blighted throughout this presentation. So you'll hear me say vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated, which is a mouthful. I'm struggling saying it right now. I will often say VAD, V-A-D, or problem properties. So just know that I'm talking about all the same subset of properties throughout. So before we get started, it would be helpful to have an understanding of who is on the call with us today and what community you come from. And Jen, I'm struggling a little bit on how to launch that poll. So are you able to launch it for me, please? Do I need to exit this? There we go, wonderful. So if you could tell me if you're coming from a rural community, suburban community, or urban community. We'll give it just a few seconds. All right. Okay, I'm gonna give it 3 more seconds, but still coming in. Okay, so it looks like there is a pretty good range of individuals coming from suburban and urban communities, and also a number of folks coming from rural communities. So that is helpful to have context. And Jen, if you could launch the second poll, that would be helpful. Does your community have a land bank or a land banking entity? So if you could answer yes, no, or you're not quite sure.
Sorry, Liz, having trouble with that second poll getting launched.
Oh, that's quite all right. We can certainly move on. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Jen. Okay, wonderful. So it looks like a number of you are not sure, which is helpful to know. We'll certainly talk about what a land bank is, where you can go to look to see if your community has a land bank. And I do see that a number of folks are coming from the yes category and also no as well. So what is a land bank? And really, we're going to start with the basics of what a land bank is and how it functions. Give me just one more. Having technical difficulties. I was saying earlier that no matter how often I use Zoom, there's always still something that I find that can trip me up. Okay, so we're going to start with why do we care? Obviously, everybody on the call today cares deeply about vacant and abandoned properties. It's why you're taking an hour out of your day post-holiday weekend to discuss this topic and learn more. And I'm really going to start with what Matt talked about on his last presentation, which is that a community's tax base is incredibly important to the health, vitality, and vibrancy of a community. Therefore, communities should really be investing in stabilizing their housing stock, really as assets, and as a way to stabilize communities. Municipalities have an opportunity to steward vacant property, specifically those that are causing harms to neighbors and neighborhoods, to responsible owners. And a way to do that is through a tool called a land bank. So what is a land bank exactly? A land bank is a public entity that is focused on converting a specific subset of properties causing harm in support of local community goals. So the important things to remember from that definition are public, focused, specific subset of properties causing harm, and in support of local community goals. Based on our information, there's over 200 land banks across the country. And the most effective land banks are those that are formed by way of state enabling legislation. And the map that's on your screen shows where those states have passed that legislation. And there's over 24 at this point in time. There has been an evolution in terms of when land banks are formed and how their legislation looks. And it started really in the 1970s with St. Louis and Cleveland and Louisville and Atlanta. The second generation of land banks happened in Michigan and Ohio. And the third generation of land banks and state enabling legislation really happened in response to the Great Recession and the housing crisis that followed. Each generation of land banking legislation has certainly learned from lessons in the past, but they've all been created as a direct result of the increasing vacant inventory within communities and as a strategy to deal with those challenges. So I bring this slide up that was part of Matt's presentation focused on the property tax system, specifically property tax enforcement, just as a friendly reminder that we're talking about when tax delinquency occurs on properties, there is a lien placed on that property. We expect that the owner is given notice and has opportunity to redeem and pay off those debts. Eventually, there is some enforcement action and a property transfer does take place. And that's where the land bank steps in, and the land bank as a tool is useful. At the bare minimum, the important powers of a land bank are to acquire tax foreclosed properties and to dispose of those properties in a way that is strategic and in line with local community goals. So while an organization doing this type of work can be called a land bank, or they can be engaged in land banking legislation, we've really found that the most effective land banks are those that are granted special powers to intervene in that tax foreclosure process by way of that state enabling legislation. Why is this so important? Well, we know that there is a clear relationship between tax delinquency, vacant properties, and community harms. So properties that are tax delinquent, if they're not causing harm to neighbors and neighborhoods, they probably will be in the future, and it's important to link those two systems together. Also, land banks operating in an effective tax foreclosure process are able to get those properties with liens that have been extinguished. They have clear, marketable, and insurable title, which we all know is so important in order to find somebody willing to reuse that property and invest in money to fix it up. So why does a land bank need to step into this system at all? In many communities, properties are simply stuck. They're not desirable on the private market because they are so upside down in value. They have so much debt on the property. And they also might be in a condition that really outweighs the fair market value of that property. So certainly being able to bring a building up to code to get a certificate of occupancy, or maybe even demolish the property if it's not able to be saved, outweighs that fair market value. Land banks are designed to step in before a property condition gets too bad or before it has too much harm within the community, to stabilize it and to shepherd it to that responsible owner, which is really critical. In most places, the properties that are held within a land bank's inventory are tax exempt. And this is really important because land banks are responsible for maintaining that property, securing it, just as any other property owner would be. And that cost certainly adds up very quickly. And so having that tax exemption is really critical. Some state enabling legislation gives land banks the ability to collect and generate revenue, which I'll get into in just a bit. Land banks also have the authority to dispose and sell properties subject to local community goals and visions in a way that's much more flexible than local government entities typically do. So in many places, local governments have to sell a property to the highest responsible bidder. There might be some politicking that happens that is involved in that sale of the property, or there might be some cumbersome bureaucratic process that doesn't make the sale of that property particularly easy for those interested in owning it or investing it. So the land bank is really created to be a nimble entity and to be transparent and flexible for those that are interested in purchasing. We often get a lot of questions about what is a land bank, how is it different from a community land trust or redevelopment authority, which a lot of folks are accustomed to and aware of. So we've created this cheat sheet of sorts to help describe the differences between those three entities, but also as a way to showcase the ways that they're complementary. So the first major difference is pretty foundational, is the legal and governance structure of the entities. Land banks, as I mentioned, are public entities. Community land trusts are traditionally private nonprofit, whereas redevelopment authorities are public authorities. Importantly, their missions also differ across entities. Oftentimes we see community land trusts form with the focus on stewarding properties for long-term affordable use, whereas land banks might also have a goal of creating and allowing for affordable housing development, but they also might have other goals. We see a lot of land banks working to acquire side lots and sell them to neighboring property owners where there's no opportunity for redevelopment, or acquiring land for the purpose of climate resiliency and stormwater management. So land banks' goals can vary, although they also might have similar goals to a land trust. Land banks and redevelopment authorities really do have broader acquisition powers, whereas a community land trust does not. However, a land bank does not have the same eminent domain powers that a redevelopment authority has. Land banks are really focused on those properties causing most harm, whereas many redevelopment authorities are focused on economic development and revitalization. And often, though not always, redevelopment authorities do acquire large parcels of land for some larger scale economic and housing opportunities. The tenure of ownership is different. Land banks act as that intermediary for that transfer of property, whereas a community land trust is holding on to that property for long term. Disposition is also different. As I mentioned, land banks have a lot more flexibility as to who they can sell to. So after I present, you're going to hear from Laura, who has a really interesting and truly unique model of a community land trust and a land bank working together in Richmond. And so she'll be able to illuminate the ways the entities are different, but how they really do work in service of a complementary goal. So how can you tell if a land bank is the right tool? A lot of folks on the call are coming from communities that don't have land banks, or they're not sure if they have them or not. The first question and place to start is ask, what problem are you trying to solve? Are the problem properties in your community truly those that are vacant, tax delinquent, and abandoned? Or are they substandard rentals? Or are they properties that the owner is paying the taxes but leaving the property vacant just in hopes the market will be rebounding soon and they can sell it for a profit later? The last two examples, really a land bank's not going to be effective in addressing those problems. And what might be needed is better housing and building code enforcement, or owners might need additional resources in order to prevent their property from going into decline. We often see communities form a land bank hoping that it's going to fix all problems within the community, and that's simply not the case. And it really does shift resources away from problems that are occurring and in the wrong direction, And it sets the entity up for failure because there's wild expectations about what the land bank can and should be doing. So it's really important to diagnose the problem within your community before deciding if a land bank is the right tool. So I briefly am going to have show my colleague Danielle's slide from her presentation. Danielle provided a lot of key sources of data for communities to take a look at the dynamics of the problem properties within their neighborhoods. And I'm simply flagging those local data sources that she talked about as being a good place to start to really diagnose the problem and taking stock of what is happening within neighborhoods. So a community has decided that it wants to form a land bank. It is the appropriate tool to address the problems at hand. The next question is, how is it funded? So land banks are funded in a variety of ways, although the most effective land banks have some sort of dedicated funding, either coming from a local jurisdiction or coming from the state. Land banks can also use federal funding, typically through CDBG, but we also understand that these sources of funding are not always predictable and scarce. Many land banks do get support from the philanthropic community. We see this typically in the form of seed funding or in terms of programs or general operating funding if there is a philanthropic agency that's mission aligns closely with the land bank. Land banks are also able to generate revenue through land sales, through rental income and developer fees. Most land bank legislation allows for funding through what's called a tax recapture. This means that properties that are put back onto the tax rolls and into productive use, a certain percentage of the tax revenue goes back to the land bank for a certain amount of years. Granted, all of the taxing bodies need to agree to this tax recapture, which would be the local, the county, and the school taxing bodies. The rationale behind the tax recapture is that, but for the land bank, those properties would continue to be vacant, they would continue to be tax delinquent, their condition would continue to deteriorate, and they would be using up scarce local government resources in terms of services that are rendered to the properties, public safety, police, fire. So a sharing of that future revenue with the land bank gives the land bank the ability to stabilize more properties. In a similar vein, some land banks do have funding, dedicated funding through mechanisms that allow for a certain percentage of delinquent taxes that are collected. The most impressive model comes from the state of Ohio and their DTAX system, which I will talk about a little later. And lastly, land banks can receive in-kind services. We see this often in rural land banks that don't necessarily have a large operations where some urban land banks do, and there might be some shared staffing. So if they have a city, personnel might also staff some of the land bank operations. There might be some shared staffing in terms of a code enforcement officer doing inspections for the land bank, or a city or municipal attorney also helping with the legal operations of the land bank. So how can land banks be most effective? It's important to know that land banks are not a one-size-fits-all model. They are highly adaptable tools, and they're really creative to reflect the local challenges and to reflect the local opportunities at hand. So each land bank across the country is different in terms of how many properties they decide to acquire, what their strategies are going to be for acquiring those properties, what their goals are and community vision is. And also those operations should and do change over time because the problems within a community can change over time. So while it's important to learn from other land banks, engage in peer exchange, technical assistance and learning, it's also important to remember that you simply can't replicate a successful program in your community. You need to learn from that program and also adapt it to the current realities on the ground in your neighborhoods. Land banks are created to benefit communities, and they are most likely to fulfill that purpose when they're working in partnership and alongside an articulated community vision, some strategic planning that happens within the neighborhoods, and really developed based on community goals. Land banks should not be designing their own visions for communities and creating their own agendas that might be disconnected from existing efforts. Also, land banks are not silver bullets. They need to be implemented in a way that's aligned with other strategies that are addressing bad properties. They need to be part of a larger revitalization effort within communities, and that's where the most impact is going to be seen. So land banks really do need to work in coordination with code enforcement efforts, with tax enforcement efforts, and other city services. Land banks are also most effective when they're partnering with other private mission-driven entities, private stakeholders within the community that are really working together on a long-term community stabilization goals. So those entities that are there and existing, working towards improving lives of neighbors and neighborhoods, land banks want to forge partnerships with those entities. And certainly transparency is incredibly important in order to demystify what exactly is a land bank, how it operates, and how it makes decisions. So for this next section, I'm going to share some reflections that our team has from the field of land banks and land banking, some mistakes that land banks often make, and also some innovators in the field that can hopefully serve as some inspiration. So the first common mistake, which I think I've hit home at this point, but am going to reiterate again because it is so incredibly important, is that communities need to have an understanding of the problems that are existing, and they need to have data that clearly articulates what that problem is. So any community that is thinking of forming a land bank or that already has a land bank really needs to take stock of what the problem is. Again, those problems can change over time, so it's important to reiterate this process. And also thinking about how it can be aligned with other community tools to address problems that come up that the land bank might not be able to solve. An example is zombie mortgages. They're a real problem in communities, but it's not quite sure how a land bank can interact with that system and really solve that problem. A great example of integrated property data systems comes from Cuyahoga County in Ohio. They have a data system called NeoCanDo. It integrates real-time city, county, state, federal data sources into a public-facing interactive online platform. It can also do predictive analysis of which properties are likely to come into the land bank inventory. So if you're interested, check them out. It's really great. Every land bank needs to be transparent. They need to develop goals, and they need to be flexible to those goals and the strategies that they implement to reach those goals. As you can see here, there are a variety of different types of goals and strategies. These are simply a sampling of the goals and strategies that we see most often. The bottom line is, again, just like the data and knowing the problem, is that the goals and strategies also need to be revisited on a regular basis, and they need to be clearly communicated with the public. One great example of that comes from the Albany County Land Bank in upstate New York. That land bank has spent considerable amount of time developing a website that is transparent and public facing. It's really interactive and easily accessible, so you can tell when land bank decisions are being made, what their goals are, who they've sold properties to, and for how much. We also know that websites can't be the only form of transparency that a land bank operates under. There's certainly a huge digital divide in this country, especially in the communities that we work in. It's just simply one example of a great website. Many land banks start off with the false expectation that they can become self-sufficient within a certain amount of years. So while a land bank should operate effectively and efficiently with the money and the funding that they have, and in a way that's equitable for communities, they also are operating on properties that have a lot of challenges to them, and in neighborhoods that have experienced decades of neglect and of disinvestment. There's certainly considerable costs to dealing with tax liens on properties, maintenance issues, rehabilitation issues that far outweigh the fair market value of the properties, which is why they're stuck in place in communities. Therefore, success is not going to happen overnight, and it's certainly going to cost money. So public support for land banks, and I mean public financial support for land banks, allows for that entity to really be focused on doing the mission-driven work and think long-term about those community goals. However, it is important to keep in mind that many land banks do generate an economic return. When a property has been vacant for so many years, putting that property back onto the tax rolls does affect the equity of neighboring property owners for the better. It does save local government money in terms of services that need to be rendered to that property. And it does generate revenue for taxing bodies. So one best practice in the field of land banking comes from Ohio with their D-tax system. It's Ohio's Delinquent Tax Assessment Collection. All delinquent property taxes, principals, penalties, and interests are put into a separate fund. 5% of that total annual amount is then paid to the land bank for the land bank to continue with its operations. And that amount needs to be approved annually by the county treasurer, but it does provide a dedicated revenue stream for the land bank that is predictable, and it allows the land bank to think long-term and strategically, and also to communicate that long-term vision with residents and folks in the neighborhood. Another example that is not legislated but might be politically feasible for communities that are on the call today comes out of southwestern Pennsylvania in the Tri-Cog Land Bank, which is where I used to work prior to coming on board with Community Progress. The Tri-Cog Land Bank is a multi-municipal land bank that operates outside of the city of Pittsburgh. Their membership includes municipalities, school districts, and the county. And all of the members, there's about 30 now, have signed onto an intergovernmental cooperation agreement and voluntarily dedicate 5% of their collected delinquent taxes in order to support the operations of the land bank. So another common mistake that is difficult to acknowledge, but it's the reality, is that many land banks are not great at community engagement. There is a great responsibility and vulnerability of being a public entity, and especially one that is working in disinvested neighborhoods on distressed properties. So with any public agency, the entity can do harm if it's not authentic in what it's intending to do, and if it's not authentically engaging with residents of that community. This example comes from Albany, where the land bank mapped out properties that were in their inventory. It clearly aligns with places and neighborhoods that have previously experienced redlining. So it's really important to just acknowledge that coming into distressed neighborhoods may trigger trauma, and engaging with communities in a way that is truthful and authentic is critically important. Individuals that are most affected by problem properties need to have the loudest voices and the most say in what decisions are being made for their neighborhoods. The Lucas County Land Bank is a great example of a land bank. They've hired a director of community engagement to do this work. Certainly, we recognize that a lot of land banks don't have the resources to hire a director of community engagement, but there's other avenues for communicating and engaging residents in the neighborhoods that the land bank is operating most in. We've seen a lot of partnerships with AmeriCorps Vistas and other entities to help supplement that work. We also see too many land banks trying to be all things to all people, and then they end up doing everything pretty poorly. So it's important to manage expectations of what a land bank can and should be doing, and recognize that there's key areas of expertise that might be needed to fulfill a mission, but really should be implemented in partnership with other experts in the field. So this includes entities that are doing environmental justice work. It includes housing developers, realtors, it includes the fire and police department. So a land bank cannot go at its work alone. It really needs to develop those partnerships. One emerging partnership that we're seeing that is really exciting over the past few years is the partnership between land banks and community land trust to develop that pipeline of affordable housing. So the map on your screen does show those places where those partnerships have been formed in a formal way, although we do know other places are exploring how a land bank and community land trust can really interact in this way. And again, you'll hear from Laura in just a few minutes about how they're working to do that in Richmond and other places in the county. So we know that there is a lot of uncertainty about what's in store for communities related to COVID-19. There's a lot that we don't know, but we certainly do anticipate that land banks are going to play a role in the recovery, however that works and looks. So the words on the screen are just a few key reminders of what makes a land bank a critical tool in terms of supporting long-term equitable recovery from COVID-19. We need entities that are nimble and flexible to the myriad of emerging challenges that lie ahead. We need entities that are publicly accountable and responsible to our communities and to our neighbors. We need entities that remain steadfast in addressing the growing inventory of vacant and abandoned properties, as we expect those inventories will grow over the next months to years. We need an entity that does not define what a community needs, but instead serves as that intermediary in order to reach those community goals. So what do we expect land banks to be doing in this kind of COVID-19 recovery? We really anticipate that land banks will double down on their part of the ecosystem for community development. And they're going to do what they do well, which is acquire tax delinquent properties that are vacant and causing harm, hold those and flexibly dispose of those for purposeful reuse. We're hoping that there is continued acknowledgement about the important roles that land banks will play in this post-COVID recovery. Not that we've reached it yet, but we anticipate it coming. Land banks are also filling a gap of the community development ecosystem that might exist in some places. So land banks might be helping out with community organizing that is happening. They're certainly starting to think about that pipeline of affordable housing that I mentioned. They're looking towards building more resilient communities and addressing natural disasters that have happened. So what's needed for land banks to be effective, especially in an equitable recovery from COVID-19? As with all places and things nowadays, funding is going to be critical. We'll just put a brief plug that there has been a bill introduced in the House, the National Land Bank Network Act of 2020, which was introduced by Congressman Dan Kildee and Congressman Drew Ferguson from Georgia, which does provide support for a national land bank and National Land Bank Network for technical assistance for shared learning opportunities and policy development. What's next for the field of land banking? We do hope and anticipate that other places will look towards establishing more dedicated revenue streams. So like the one that I'd mentioned in Ohio, which is really a best practice, but thinking about that long-term sustainability. We are seeing that land banks are receiving greater inventories of vacant land, and so they're thinking about how to use that vacant land in a way that's strategic and also in line with resiliency planning and planning for natural disasters. We're seeing that land banking and land banks are being considered a critical tool in community development and no longer this fringe tool that some places have while some don't. And lastly, we're hoping that land banks really have the resources and time needed to evaluate their impacts and their outcomes in order to determine their success for the future. It certainly is a challenge for many public entities that try to use their scarce resources in developing and implementing their work to reach their mission. But in New York State, in 2016, the New York Attorney General's office took a look at the land banks in New York to determine the economic impacts that they were having. And as you can see by the numbers on your screen, it is pretty profound, the economic impacts that land banks can have when they're used in a way that's strategic and in line with other organizations and entities doing the work. They also estimated that it saved about $19 million in surrounding home values because that intervention was had. So with that, just on your screen is some resources that are on Community Progress's website. They're all free for download, so please go ahead and take a look at those if you're interested. So with that, I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to you, Laura.
Great, thank you very much for that, Liz. I appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone here today, and looking forward to sharing with you all a little bit about what's going on in Richmond. I also want to thank Wendy and the team at NAR, the Realtor Party Resources. All of the work that you're going to see and hear me talk about today is really in many ways a testament to the resources that we've had available to us through the National Association of Realtors. Richmond Association of Realtors has become, I think, a bit notorious in seeking the funds of the National Association, and we're really grateful for what they've done for us. So if there are folks on the call that are thinking about doing any of this work more deeply, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the resources that the Realtor Party provides. The Richmond Association of Realtors has been at this work for a very long time. We began in 2004. We established the Partnership for Housing Affordability. That nonprofit, it's a 501c3 nonprofit, came about because I would go and testify at a local government hearing about cash proffers or other policies, land use and housing policies that we felt like were artificially driving up the cost of housing. And we looked around and we really didn't have a lot of company. And so we said, you know, we need to create a nonprofit that really begins to make the case that affordable housing from rental to home ownership is an economic development initiative, a priority for the community, that also that we need to have an opportunity to make the case that affordable housing is really part of a community's quality of life. And so we formed the nonprofit in 2004. And then in the early part of, I guess around 2010 or so, 2012, we actually invited, through a grant from the National Association, Center for Community Progress, to come to Richmond to help us think through what could we do with our blighted tax delinquent parcels, our challenged parcels, because we have about 2,500 of them in Richmond at that time. And out of that conversation came the strategy of a community land trust. And as Liz has said, there are differences, but complementary alignment between the land trust and land bank. The land bank is a part of the work of the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. It's unusual to have an existing nonprofit serve as a land bank, as opposed to having the land bank as a public entity. But in our case, the land bank works under the auspices of the land trust. And I want to go into a little bit about what a land trust is, but to give you a sense of the magnitude of the challenge for the city of Richmond specifically, this is what our tax delinquent property map looked like about 4 or 5 years ago. And you can see that we're looking at almost 2,500 units of delinquent parcels, tax delinquent parcels, but we're also looking at $20 million in tax revenue, real estate tax revenue that the city of Richmond could have been collecting but was not. Now, there's one way to look at this. You can look at this map and you can see a tremendous challenge. You can also look at this map and see incredible opportunity. And that's what we saw. We saw an opportunity to take thousands of tax delinquent, often vacant parcels, and instead of having overgrown grass and trash, build beautiful, new, energy efficient, affordable, permanently affordable housing through the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust.
Hey, Laura, can I, this is Liz. Sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind going to the slideshow function so that folks can see those maps a little clearer? If you want to click slideshow and then from current slide.
Is that good?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Anyway, so the way the land trust model works is that our homeowners own the house, and we, the nonprofit, own the land under the house. And so when our homeowner has free use of that land and that parcel, of course it's governed by a land lease, but when the homeowner goes to sell, there is a equity split. And so the landowner, the entity selling the house is able to gain equity, but the house is permanently affordable. So our goal at the Maggie Walker Land Trust has been to create inclusive wealth building opportunities. We know in metropolitan Richmond that historically there have been folks that have been marginalized, shut off from the opportunity for wealth building through home ownership. We want to work on that challenge, but we also want to make sure that once we build a house that's affordable, we want it to remain affordable for the next homeowner and the next and the next. So that's how the land trust model works. Whoops, let me go back here. Whoops. Okay. This is a picture of the first land trust house that we built. Again, energy efficient up in the Churchill neighborhood, metropolitan Richmond. This is a neighborhood that had seen deterioration for many, many years, but then began to see private sector development come in, began to see rapid price appreciation, and folks that had been in this community for generations were beginning to feel pushed out. So in this instance, we were able to take a tax delinquent parcel, build a new home in keeping with the character of the community, build a beautiful home, sold it for $195,000 to a person making less than 100% of area median income. This is a map currently of the land trust holdings. We work not only in the city of Richmond, but in the suburban jurisdictions of Chesterfield and Henrico County. We have gone from 0 to 54 homeowners in 3 years, and we have a pipeline of 75 properties And I want to reinforce something that Liz said a number of times, and that is that whether you're a land trust or land bank, you cannot do all things well. And partnerships are extraordinarily important. So while we require our homeowners to have home ownership counseling, we don't do that counseling. We partner with another nonprofit. We have built only a very few of our homes. Most of our homes are built by other housing nonprofits, and then we take ownership of them. So, in an effort to get to scale, partnerships are critically important in that regard. Now, why we made the transition or began to incorporate land banking into our work as a land trust. A few years ago, we went down to the General Assembly, which is our state legislature, and we asked them to pass enabling legislation that would allow local governments to designate an existing nonprofit as their land bank. It would also allow land banks to hold property, and as long as the property resided in the land bank, there was no real estate taxes to be paid on that property. So for us as the land trust, to be able to hold our properties also in the land bank, it was a tax benefit to us to get that status. The other important thing about a land bank, and I think Liz made this clear, is it's really about holding on to property and thinking about what is in the community's best interests in the future use of this property. It's not always about the highest, best use in terms of what's the dollar yield on the property, but rather what's in the best interest of the community. And, it's just like the name implies, a bank, you make deposits of parcels into the bank. The deposits are withdrawn, but they can be held, and they can be held in trust. They can be held by good stewards. And particularly, you can bring parcels in that may not be ready for development today, but they may well be ready for development in 3 years. And again, the community will have a vested interest in how that parcel is developed and how it's reutilized. So although we anticipate and have received most of our parcels come from local governments, we made sure that we set up our land bank so it could receive private property. And sure enough, the first private parcel that we have received, fittingly, is an old bank branch, Bank of America building in the north side of Richmond. As Liz pointed out, community engagement is a critical part of the work of the land bank. Now, we actually, as the land trust, have a director of community engagement. She's our face in the community. She's worked very hard to educate folks about what a land trust does. But in terms of this property, we went to Bank of America. We asked them for a grant for $10,000, and we are paying another nonprofit that is located where this bank building, in the community where this bank building is, to do community engagement. We as the land bank are fairly agnostic as to what is housed in this building. We want the community to tell us what they want done with this building, whether they want to locate nonprofits that focus on workforce development or credit counseling or home ownership counseling, or maybe they need a food bank distribution center, or maybe they need a health hub. We're going to spend the next few months, although it's more challenging in a COVID environment, working with the nonprofit to engage the community in a series of charrettes or conversations about the future use of this building. This is another example. This is a property that came to us in December from, again, a suburban jurisdiction. This property was an old school building, old elementary school. It had some asbestos issues. Was never going to be a school building again. It was just going to sit there and continue to deteriorate. And so the county asked if we would take the property in. They immediately, once they deeded it to the land bank, it was understood that this particular property would go into the land bank, but be used by the land trust. And so they raised the school, and although the site plan suggests 11 houses, we think we're probably just going to be able to put 10, but there will be 10 permanently affordable homes built on this community. This particular community sits in the shadows of Virginia State University, which is a land grant college, a historically Black college, which has a strong agricultural program. And so we're hoping that we might be able to partner with the university to create a community garden as a feature of that community. This is another, one of our other jurisdictional partners in Henrico County. They had an old pump station that was not in use anymore and wanted a residential unit to be built on this parcel. Another nonprofit, the Better Housing Coalition, was looking to do the state's first home via 3D printed technology, and they decided to partner with us. We acquired the parcel through the county, and then they will build this very cool looking home on that parcel. This is my last slide. It's a map of our current inventory. What properties have come in, once have been disposed, which ones we've received when we haven't designated a use. In the city of Richmond, we have a citizens advisory panel. It's a 9-person panel that provides insight or input into how properties are disposed. So the properties come in. Any nonprofit, for the first 2 years of our operation as a land bank, we only allowed nonprofits to seek our properties. We now allow for-profit developers to come in and request properties. First of all, the advisory panel decides what the use of the parcel should be. Should it be single family? Should it be multifamily? Should it be commercial? Should it be a agricultural use? Then the nonprofits, all the parcels are on the website. Liz talked about transparency as a public entity. We put our parcels up. Nonprofits bid on or make application to receive the properties. Then the panel makes a decision about which nonprofits are to receive which parcels. And let me just say, we are guided by the priorities of the local government. Some local government's priority is single family housing, affordable housing. Some are going to, at some point, have a priority on more green space. Some are focused on revitalization. So it's really about which properties they wish us to acquire and then how they wish us to dispose of them. Once the nonprofits are selected, they receive our properties pretty much at cost. When we receive a property from a local government, it costs us about $2,500 per parcel. Some of these parcels, if they went to auction, if they went to a tax sale auction, would be going for $35,000 to $50,000. So we're receiving the properties at a tremendous discount. We pass that discount on to our nonprofit partners. If a for-profit developer wishes to receive a property from the bank, they're going to be paying more than the nonprofit. They're probably going to pay assessed value. But again, the assessed value could come in easily, $15,000, $20,000 less than if that private developer had to compete at auction. The reason we charge more for a private developer is because that allows us to capitalize the ongoing work of the bank. Liz is right. We're never going to be able to capitalize the work of the bank through that one source, but the less money I have to beg from philanthropy, the more I like it. So we're trying to develop diverse streams of income. We're on schedule to take another 30 properties in from the city. And so this has really been a wonderful opportunity for the Richmond Association of Realtors to incubate the nonprofit, to in turn incubate the land trust, our finance department here at RAR continues to be the financial backbone of the land trust, land bank. And, you know, I started my career at the association as the lobbyist here. And as a lobbyist, you always want a seat at the table when policy's being made. Now I feel like with this work, we're not only at the table, we're close to the head of the table when we're having conversations with our local government partners about the wise use of their parcels, their land, their vacant properties. How do we put them back into the community in a use that's beneficial for all the residents? So it's been and continues to be a very humbling but rewarding opportunity for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura and Liz, for your presentations. We are ready to move into the question and answer portion of today's webinar. But before I do that, I wanted to take a moment to say congratulations to Laura Lafayette. She was recently named to the Virginia Business Magazine's inaugural edition of the Virginia 500, the 2020 Power List. She was recognized in the real estate category last week. The list, which includes 20 categories, takes into account annual revenue, newsworthiness, community involvement, diversity, number of employees, and the size of presence in the Commonwealth. So if what Laura shared is just a sample of what she's been doing with the association, we see why she was recognized with that honor. So again, congratulations.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of questions that came in into the chat. And so I'll start with those, and then certainly if anyone else wants to raise their hand and speak with our panelists, you can do that. Or continue to type your questions. So the first question, this came in early in the presentation, Liz, and so you, I think you've touched on it, but I do want to just go ahead and ask the question, which was, are all or most land banks administered by local government?
It's a great question. So land banks, those land banks with state enabling legislation, if your state has that, typically it requires that the local government pass also some type of legislation or agreement to form a land bank. However, the administration of that land bank differs widely across the country and really depends on the size and operational capacity of that land bank. So for many of our larger cities, the land bank has their own staff that administer the program of the land bank and the tools, and they do work with local government in terms of prioritizing properties that are in line with community goals, but their operations are completely separate from the city, and their staffing is separate. Also, I touched on it just briefly, but the governance structure of a land bank is separate from that of city government as well, and how that government structure looks, it takes a different shape in each state. That's kind of the theme you'll hear probably throughout my answers. But so some of those governance structures might include folks from the city, and oftentimes they include other stakeholders. We've seen that be a place where realtors are very influential in terms of the governance of the land bank. So it's really for those smaller land banks where they might have some city staff administering the program. A few of the examples I showed, I think, spanned the variety in terms of cities and suburban land banks. One really interesting rural land bank in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, they acquire 5 to 10 properties a year, really for that strategic purpose when a property is simply stuck. And so because of that, they rely on that city staff person to intervene when they need the tool to be used.
Great, thank you. My next question is for Laura. You know, I know just in having worked with you a little bit and being having kind of on the mailing list of the Maggie Walker Land Trust, I know that the group, what you all do, you're very intentional in terms of making sure you are taking into consideration the communities that you work in, the disinvestment that has happened in those communities. Can you tell me a little bit about how the other partners that you work with, how do you bring them into the fold in terms of really taking an equitable approach to how you choose to sell your homes and who you choose to sell them to, and why is that so important in the work that you're doing?
Well, when we originally began work with the land trust, and I will have to own this, because of fair housing concerns, I said to the staff of the land trust, we're not going to talk about our buyers in terms of their demographics. Let's not have that conversation in the boardroom. Let's make sure that we are working in communities where we're seeing rapid price appreciation. We had done some kind of predictive analytics in terms of, I'll use the word gentrification, but we're really talking about price appreciation. And we began to see neighborhoods change. And after about a year or so, we realized that we weren't as intentional as we could and should be about this idea of inclusive wealth building and giving more folks an opportunity. And so now we do look at the home ownership rate of people of color and the Maggie Walker Land Trust. And I'm pleased to say that whereas the city's rate for people, folks of color of home ownership last year was only at 17%, ours was at 60%. The point is you have to be intentional if you do want to bridge inequities. They don't get bridged, through natural market forces. I'll just be blunt about that. I think the other value in Richmond, it's a 1.3 million small town. So a lot of nonprofit leadership have worked together for a very long time. We know each other, we trust each other. And so it's really a partnership of, who's going to work in what community. We have seen greatest progress when 3 or 4 nonprofits are working in the same community. And so we're also working with our housing authority, who have about 100 vacant parcels in one community, to draw those down, put them in the bank. And because we can't do 100 properties in 1 year, but if we hold them in the bank, then our nonprofit partners will be able to pull those properties down and develop in an orderly fashion. So working to scale means working collaboratively, one community at a time.
Great, thank you. My next question is for Liz, I believe. Can you explain the difference between a community improvement corporation and a land bank? And then the person who wrote the question put in parentheses, this might be synonymous with redevelopment entity. And I think you had a slide or something that touched on the differences a little earlier.
Yeah, the cheat sheet is a slide that we get a lot of requests for, and I think is similar and can help answer this question. I would say that a community improvement corporation and a land bank are different, specifically in the types of properties that they're attempting to acquire and the way they do so and why. So as I mentioned, land banks typically work within the tax foreclosure process. They're given special tools that's allowed through that state enabling legislation to acquire those properties that are typically vacant and tax delinquent, and they're able to flexibly dispose of those properties. Land banks can operate on residential properties and commercial properties, but a lot of land banks do focus on the residential side of things in terms of their portfolio and just having larger amounts of residential properties in their inventory. A community improvement corporation, I believe, typically focuses on properties for the purpose of economic development. They might have a focus on industrial properties. And so the tool is different, and their mission and the work that they're doing in communities is different. But I will say it does also reflect kind of this larger ecosystem of community development. A land bank certainly can't be the only tool out there looking to acquire problem properties. And so other entities and organizations that have complementary work really do work hand in hand with the land bank for stabilization.
Great, thank you. And while you're unmuted, Liz, the next question I'm going to pitch to you is, I noticed that there are no land banks in the Southwest or California. Is there a reason for this that you know of?
I don't have a real specific reason as to why that happens. We know that land banks have been formed in communities as a direct response to growing inventories of vacant and abandoned properties. And so certainly the kind of 3 generations of land banks that I talked about, Many of those first iterations of land banks happened in kind of the Rust Belt of the country, in the Midwest and Northeast. Certainly after the 2008 housing crisis, there was larger influx of vacant properties in other community sunshine states, Nebraska to Alabama to Virginia. And so it's really a direct result of vacant properties coming on board in larger amounts. We have been getting some questions from other states west of the Mississippi interested in land banking, and it might just be that it hasn't yet been a priority from those cities because it hasn't posed such a widespread problem as we've seen in other places. I will say too, I'm not sure what California's tax foreclosure process is, but some states have some pretty tricky tax foreclosure processes to navigate where they sell their tax liens. And so that's why we've seen land banks not be successful in some other states.
Great, thank you. So Laura, I have two questions for you. The first one is a pretty quick answer, I think. Was the 3D printed property a multifamily unit?
I don't believe so. I believe it's a single family property.
Got it, thank you. This next question is a little longer and actually has two parts. So it says, how are potential environmental issues addressed and resolved when acquiring properties? So I'll just ask that first part first, and then I'll finish it up.
Well, to the best of our ability, we do not take property that would require a significant remediation. During the enabling legislation conversation, the bill as drafted required the land bank to take any property that the local government transferred to it. And we raised our hand and said, whoa, time out. We do not want to take any property they want to give us. So we are holding some property right now as an act of good faith for the city that will take many years to develop because it's going to have some issues. But by and large, we're not going to take on those properties because we can't afford to take on properties with substantial environmental remediation.
Great, thank you. And the second, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Wendy, do you mind if I jump in?
Oh, please, go ahead, thank you.
This, I think, is a great question and a great reason why there is such a need for coordinated partnerships with other entities and land banks. We've seen places where a municipality might have EPA grant funding to do phase 1 and phase 2 assessments or remediation and can kind of take on that work prior to the land bank taking on that property. So certainly, as Laura said, it's incredibly expensive and land banks aren't funded in a way to support that work. But if there's other organizations and entities that are able to access those pools of funding, it can help to kind of augment the response to that property.
Great, thank you for that additional information. Laura, the next part of that question is regarding disposition. Is zoning flexibility offered in Richmond? And then they go on to say, you mentioned that the community decides whether they want commercial, single family, multifamily, et cetera. And I think that may have been a reference to that Bank of America property where you said you're going to have some community engagement to find out what the community really wants to go in that space.
So in the city of Richmond, it's a two-step process. We actually write a land bank plan for the year and submit it to the administration and to our city council, our legislative body. And so we've already talked with the city administration about what are the priorities. And so far they've been affordable housing with subset priorities of community gardens. And so that's the first level of decision making. As far as the bank building goes, that's where we would have input into the community. I mean, that building is going to be what it is physically. So the only question is what work or what programs does it house? And that's where we feel it's really important that we get the community voice. But we are typically receiving property, and the zoning that's attached as we receive it is the zoning that goes forward.
Great, thank you. My next question is for Liz, and someone is asking if the Center for Community Progress provides consulting services to municipalities or other nonprofits who are considering creating a land bank or a land trust.
Yes, we certainly do. Community Progress is actually kind of the land banking headquarters nationally. We've helped the majority of the states pass state enabling legislation since 2008. So if your community is interested in having conversations, certainly reach out. I would also say that on our website, we have a land banking headquarters page, which I'll put in the chat after I wrap up here. It shows where the different land banks are across the country, has some frequently asked questions. There is free resources for communities considering land banking. The resource is called Land Banks and Land Banking, of all things, which has some template ordinances and policies that might be helpful to think about. So I would say certainly reach out. You can start there as well to take a look at what type of legal structure might be needed in your community.
Great, thank you. So a question came through that I think might be directed to NAR, so I'll answer that. And the question is, does NAR have partnerships with various land banks? And then they go on to say, I thought that they being NAR would help with grants for property development. So NAR does not have any partnerships directly with any land bank. And in terms of the grants that we offer, there might be an opportunity to get a grant to do some sort of study related to the housing issues in your area, the land use that's happening in your community, or things that you want to see that might inform you as to whether or not a land bank or a land trust might be a good way to go. And someone just popped in, oh, okay, Liz put in some information about Center for Community Progress, but also what I'll do before we close out is just put the website there for the Realtor Party, where you can go and get additional information about the resources that NAR has. I have a question for Laura, which might be the last question unless anyone else wants to type something in there. And you talked a lot about partnerships with local government. You talked a lot about the resources you've used from NAR. And so certainly we have associations on the webinar today that are in various stages of their relationship building with local government. So if you could maybe, just for those who might be starting out, whether it's a land bank or just any other type of relationship you're trying to cultivate, how do they start? How do you recommend they move forward with building those relationships with local government and community partners to be able to achieve a larger goal, whether it's a land bank or some other housing or land use objective?
Well, I mean, I think partnerships and relationships take time. I mean, you know, and so you have to be committed and willing to invest time in sitting with local officials, sitting with your community development partners again and again and again. And there will be time when you don't think you've made much progress, but it's just part of the relationship is coming back again to the table. I also will say that one thing I've learned over the last 20 some years is that local governments have to diagnose their own problem. They're not going to want you to come in and say, here are the 12 things that are wrong with your community that we can help you fix. It's far better and it's far easier to develop a partnership if they are saying, if you come to them and say, we want to be helpful. How can we be helpful? You tell us. And once they've diagnosed their challenges and their challenges have become painful enough, then I think they will welcome that relationship and that partnership. And I think local governments are beginning to understand that the nonprofit community can draw down philanthropic dollars to leverage their public dollars. And so I think it's not just about, are they two-way partnerships, RAR and a local government. It's really the nonprofit, the for-profit, the association, and the philanthropic folks all coming together and saying, what do we do best? And let's align our work and be in constant communication with one another.
Great, thank you. And before I wrap, Liz, did you have any closing comments or just last words? If not, that's fine.
No, just that I'm impressed with all of the work that Laura is doing out in Richmond, and certainly is an innovator in the field in terms of that relationship with the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. So I enjoyed hearing that, and thanks for everything that you've done for this webinar series, Wendy.
Great, thank you. And since I'm not able to type and talk at the same time, there is a request to put in the chat the link for the NAR resources. So If Christine Wendell, if you're on, if you wouldn't mind just typing in just the Realtor Party, just the landing page for the Realtor Party website, that would be great. And folks can go from there and look for the grant information under housing opportunities, smart growth, et cetera. So I do want to again thank Liz and Laura for their time today, for sharing this information. And thank you for all of you who have participated in the webinar series, whether today was your first one or if you've been on all four. I do want to say thank you to Center for Community Progress, and in particular Liz, who's been a great partner in planning all four of these and helping us secure great speakers. Thanks again to Laura and to all the Realtor associations who have participated in the series. Again, if you didn't have a chance to view them live, you can go just to that link that was just put up there in the Realtor Party area and view the recordings. I hope you've learned something that has inspired you or intrigued you to go and find some additional information. To all the Realtor associations on the call, please do take advantage of the resources we have through the Realtor Party. There's a ton of information, and yes, grants are fantastic, but there's just also a lot of information, a lot of white papers, resources where you can research land use ordinances, just a ton of resources available to you. There's a webinar tomorrow actually on our land use database, and you can go to the Realtor Party site and find that information and register. So we really want to provide as much information as we can to you to help you with your advocacy goals related to housing, land use, and whatever other community development efforts you're undertaking. So again, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.